friends, I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. Welcome back for another session of sorts. This is, again, kind of a little bit of a resume of my gaming collection, what I've got access to, which I'm hoping will kind of steer people so that they kind of either understand me and what I value in games and what I've collected, or maybe this will, inspire somebody to go, ooh, that sounds really cool. I want to know more about that. And especially since the games that I'm going to start with are going to be some of the older ones that aren't really seen in circulation so often, depending on, what you regularly have access to, that hopefully they'll catch, some imagination. Maybe people want to see or know more about these games and maybe try them themselves. So this one is the very first actual role-playing book I ever owned. So, this is the Basic Dungeons & Dragons Player's Manual. Now, this doesn't look shiny and everything, and that's because feels so soft and comforting. This is, of course, been very heavily used. It is badly worn. Right next to it, I have the similarly worn Expert Rulebook. Now, what they look like when these were new, not completely new, but newer, was this. Oh, sorry. This is the Player's Manual. And the Expert Set. Now, what these books did, besides bring me into the role-playing world, was this was a deliberate evolution of the game to try to make Dungeons & Dragons more accessible to people. It existed at the same time as the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game. As a matter of fact, there were several iterations of what's considered basic expert Dungeons & Dragons. Two different sets preceded this particular set, which were created by different writers named Mulvey and Holmes. And this was put together and brought into its state by another writer, Frank Menser, whose name echoes pretty loudly through gaming history. What this did, though, was this represented a significant change in the attitude and tone of Dungeons & Dragons. Rather than being this very wordy, very high language collection of rules and guidelines, really, this codified everything and simplified the game so that it could be absorbed into bite-sized chunks by just about anyone. It was written in an engaging and friendly style. It doesn't immediately start you off with rules, rules, rules. It actually tells a story first, and then it interjects game rules along the way that you can easily pick up and understand. How do you make an attack roll? What is a damage roll? How do you make a saving throw? In a short little dungeon encounter with your starting primer character, just having a few minor encounters to start out with and teach you how to play. And it was very effective. I found this very engaging, and I've read that opening scenario many times. And it's still, I think, one of the finest ways of bringing new people into the game and exposing them to a role-playing game and mechanics. It's still excellent for that. Now, the genius of the basic sets was that they brought people in slowly. If you had Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or if you had the original White Box Dungeons & Dragons, or some of the even earlier editions, the earliest editions were a war game. Your actual combat mechanics and rules were a war game. It was called Chainmail, and was made by TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, back in the day. They actually had their war game as the conflict resolution system for the role-playing game. And quite honestly, the role-playing game back then was primarily, what is your role in the group? Are you the warrior who stands in front and risks death to buy your allies some time to influence the fight and hopefully win the day for you? Are you the healer who everyone tries to keep alive so that you can gain more experience and be able to heal grievous injuries with a spell. Or are you the magic user who can eventually get powerful enough to destroy entire threats at a time and make combats much quicker and easier for your group? All of these things were elements of Dungeons & Dragons and have continued to be elements of Dungeons & Dragons. But as Dungeons & Dragons got more and more narrative and things became more and more about players' choices and the rules got more and more basically codified so that everybody could understand it. It wasn't just the dungeon master who had access to the rules and everyone else just kind of played according to what the dungeon master decreed because all the rules were in the dungeon master's book. This started the elements of taking that out of the dungeon master's hands. It gave players a matrix to compare, and when they rolled their dice they could say, I hit this armor class. And now the dungeon master would say, yes, you hit, or no, you did not hit with that armor class. So it was a pretty giant change, honestly, from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and Dungeons & Dragons before it. And the basic set allowed you to play the first 3 levels in any of the core classes: the fighter, the magic user, the thief, the cleric, or 3 races that were the demi-human races, which basically functioned as their own class. You had the elf, who was a fighter magic user, and you had the dwarf, or the halfling, which were both fighters with their own peculiar little quirks. All of them had some racial bonuses and things that gave them some strategic advantages, but if you played rules as written, they also had some handicaps down the road and usually took a lot more experience to level up. So there was a lot of good incentive to play humans. It's kind of strange that way, but especially if you look at it from the eyes of somebody who's only ever played modern versions of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, the expert set was a little different. This one had both the player's rules and the Dungeon Master's rules in one book, and it expanded on what you could do with the game. Of course, it gave you the rules for characters to go up to 10th level, so that's quite a window of power with a lot of new spells that you would have access to, but also they expanded the weapon selection and items that you could carry so that you could cover a lot of different details in the game that the basic set just didn't think you needed to be encumbered with right away. So it left things very simplistic and relatively limited in scope. This allowed you to expand on that, slowly bring your characters about as their world widened, as their characters got more powerful. Also, this had rules for exploring the wilderness. So those wilderness explorers guides and things, that's built into this. So all of a sudden you have rules on how to do a hex crawl and how to go into uncharted wilderness and map it out to make it known to everybody and to explore all the wonders of the wilderness. It also had ideas for city adventures, so that you could kind of have dungeon-like adventures within a city, not have to keep going out to actual dungeons all the time. But that gets explained and elaborated on a little bit later. This one definitely was more of a focus of going out and finding adventures where you could. Then there was the companion set. Now, for a collector, the dream is to have all the boxes and have them all in nice condition with the original dice and for some of them, the original crayons that went with that, but I'm not that much of a collector that I have to have all of that. I'd be just as happy just having the books themselves to read and reference in case I ever wanted to use these. More on that in a second. The companion set took you past 20th level. I think it took you up to 25th. It says ages 10 up. I believe it would take you up to 25th, though. And, of course, this was split again into a Player's Handbook and a Dungeon Master's Handbook again. And this, of course, gave you even more options for what you could do with your character. Yeah, up to 25th. So, for instance, if you were playing a cleric and you thought druids sound cool, nature and all that, if you were a neutral cleric, you could become a druid. And they had different rules for leveling and restrictions on how you could become a more powerful druid. Your fighters would have to make a decision whether they wanted to be a landholder, they wanted to build a castle or fortification, and they would try to become a baron and move up in the nobility, or they could just be a wandering knight and go and fix things. So all your characters basically had a choice whether they were going to continue adventuring by roaming around and finding problems where they were, or settling down. In this kind of a campaign scenario, the kingdom building aspect kind of became more of a thing, and plenty of rules in there for that. But if you wanted to continue wandering, again, even more and more powerful monsters, and the monsters generally scaled up. You found more and more powerful ones as you went up the companion set. The monsters were considerably deadlier than they would have been in the expert set. Then came the master set, which I do not have. I've never run characters in Dungeons & Dragons powerful enough to ever need the master set. I have run characters that needed to get up past 10th level to go into the companion set. I had a campaign that ran like that, but never got so high as to need the master set. Quite honestly, that's such an incredible amount of playing. I don't know if I could keep a group's interest for that long, and my own at the same time. I do enjoy a good, long, meaty campaign, but once you start going into the high 20s and 30th level, it gets a bit much. But the master set gives you the last of the rules of the core game, so that by the time you're done with all of those sets, you have had a game almost that gets about as complicated as Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So now you're prepared for something that's a little bit step up in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which is the point of the whole thing all along. Once you've gotten through Dungeons & Dragons, you could stay and keep playing it, certainly. There's no limitations on what you could create with this game. But you are also capable of the advanced rules mechanics that you would be able to use in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, certainly. And then I also have the Immortals set, which I've never used and really will probably never use. Number one, in my opinion, they're not very good. It's very hard to comprehend the idea of playing godlings who want to get to be more and more powerful gods themselves. The affairs of the Immortals are things that just... I've read some of the adventures, and it just... I don't find them to be very engaging or fun. So I don't really have any designs on this game. I have it for, so that I could read it. I was curious, and I actually have two sets because I got a collection, and it just happened to include a second set of Immortals rules. But I'll probably end up giving that to somebody someday. But the advantage of having the Immortals rules is when Dungeons & Dragons was over and they weren't going to make any more with it, they did eventually sunset the game, and what they ended up doing was creating a master stroke. They made the Rules Cyclopedia. Now, these books are kind of pricey because it's a very good game. It is a standalone game. This is not something that requires anything else. This has basically all of the rules from basic up through Masters. It doesn't really have the Immortals. It mentions the Immortals, but it doesn't really include a great deal about them. It has a solid selection of all of the different monsters, although I could tell you it doesn't have every monster from all of the different books. It has an excellent selection of them, though, and a very good treasure table, so that you can do quite well with what you've got here. And then if you have the other books, you can look for particulars in those. This, however, had some other things that were kind of useful. They talked about a lot of the options that you would have had from higher books, so that if you're already familiar with Dungeons & Dragons and you don't need to be started off at basic level, this has everything you need to go forward and kind of understand where things go when you get to higher levels, like the choice of being a landholder knight, or a chaotic fighter who is an avenger. The different detailings of higher level are all included right alongside of the characters because it is a decision that you have to make throughout your career. In addition to that, all of the stuff, the characters go from 1st to 36th level, as high as they would have gone in Masters. So all the rules are complete, including some of the more advanced rules from Master Set, which work to try to make the characters continue to be interesting and evolving, even after the point where most of the characters were getting very minimum bumps going up a level. 1 or 2 hit points, maybe access to a relatively minor power here and there. But if you were a fighter and you survived up to 26th, 27th level, a new level meant relatively little to you. Whereas if you were a wizard, oh, that's another high-level spell I can cast. Mwahahaha. So, kind of how Dungeons & Dragons has always worked to a certain extent, but at least in modern games they did do every effort they could to try to get advanced abilities and things for other classes. But this Rules Cyclopedia is an excellent resource for people who are already familiar with Dungeons & Dragons and just want to tell the story without having to cycle through all of those different books. Very good resource. Combined extraordinarily well. And I've got 3 copies of these myself so that when I run this game system, people can have access to the books as they need to. So, although 3 might be a little excessive, one of these days I might end up donating one to a worthy cause. Now, on top of that, of course, there are modules. There are several adventures that are near and dear to my heart. And just because it was basic didn't mean they weren't good adventures. The quality went up and down, as they always have. Some are really well written and really deep or have a really good surprise or an overall excellent story. Some of them are just a castle that's thrown at you that you have to plunder, or a cave that it's time to explore. Without a great deal of thought, not very rational encounters, or things that just generally don't make a lot of sense if you think about them. That's how early adventures were. Some of them seem like they were made by random dice roll, which I've never thought was a really great way of running adventures. But those are, that is the very first role-playing game that I ever really got into and played, and the first one that I had a campaign that lasted any length of time. I played with some friends back in high school, and eventually created a campaign that I think no less than 9 or 10 different people had poked their nose in at the very least and ran a character for a little while, and the core 4 or 5 people played, and we got well over 10th level with them. So I made a lot of my earliest mistakes with doing that. Sure, running GM NPCs that were stupidly powerful. Yeah, I did that. But at the same time, it was a great way to start running, and a lot of the things that were written for Dungeon Masters were cornerstones of the way I experience and understand gaming, even to this day. So this is an excellent way to start a role-playing career. I find I don't have a problem recommending it to other people, although, again, it can be a little harder to get a hold of since the books are out of print. But if you don't mind reading off of a PDF, that's fine. And if you can get a hold of the Cyclopedia, you'll have access to all the rules in one place, which is a sensational deal, if you can find it. So, another slice of my collection, and we will be covering that because I think that, again, this is an important part of Dungeons & Dragons history, which makes it a fairly important part of gaming history. It represents a change in the direction and perspective that Dungeons & Dragons was going to become more attractive to the masses, which is why I think that this game's vision really demonstrated how they were tipping their hands and eventually going into 2nd edition, making it more accessible to other people, which still wasn't quite mastered by that time and really took 3rd edition and a completely different change of hands at the wheel to make that become the dynamo that it eventually became in cultural status as well as the gaming landscape. So, but that's what I've got for the core books for basic Dungeons & Dragons. I will be getting the master set eventually. Kind of have to at some point. So just as soon as I see it someplace, even if it's just the books, I don't need the box set. Although if I find a box set, I'll take it. Sure, why not? but obviously I would hope for something quality-wise at least as good as the ones I've shown you. So I have never read the Master Set, but I can infer a lot of it because I have read the Rules Cyclopedia, and anything that doesn't fit in with the basic expert or companion was clearly taken from the Master Set. And again, understanding the reason you needed to keep coming up with ways to make characters more powerful, to keep engaging them, to want to continue to level up. So, but that is my basic Dungeons and Dragons on up to Immortal. And yeah, you're very welcome to ask about any of that if you'd like, which we'll be making videos for in turn. The next set that I have to show you will be my 2nd edition set, which is not as robust. Even though I did play an awful lot of 2nd edition back in the day, I was a college kid back then and mostly leaned on my friends' libraries. So now that I am older and more experienced, a lot of the books that I turned to and started buying for myself really started in 3rd edition, as well as other systems altogether. So 2nd edition will be relatively quick and simple and hopefully painless. Although, if you wanted to get into 2nd edition, there's an awful lot out there to collect. But until next time, I'm Rob. This has been another mini session of sorts. Thanks for joining me. I hope this entertained you. Maybe it was a little walk down memory lane. This is not the full review. There's plenty more to talk about with all of these books. And if you wish to hear about those, please leave them in the comments below. I pay attention to all of that, and that can very much steer me in the direction that I make future videos. So, if you want to have a hand on the tiller, that's how you do it. I'll see you next time, hopefully, and until then, I am the Dungeon Tutor, and I look forward to our next session. Thank you, and farewell.